Okay, next set. Symbol and icon. First, icon just means a very dense symbol. So an icon is a symbol that has a complex multiple meanings. A stop sign, for example, in American or European societies, it would be an icon. It means a bunch of stuff, and it can be used in a bunch of ways, and frequently is in terms of sort of graphic art. Another one would be a cross, in Christianity, or various symbols that you find in other religions. Um, so icons are actually quite rare. And they're subject to very complex meanings. I suppose from a marketing standpoint, I'm not sure if it is anymore, but the McDonald's arch used to be an icon. There were a whole mess of actual lawsuits about, how that was so iconic that you couldn't make anything close to it because it would sort of assume that, or imply that it's somehow tied to McDonald's. So uh, an icon is a very small subset of symbols. The vast majority of symbols are not iconic, and icons generally are still within a particular cultural context, in the sense that a particular group's values and attitudes are attached to this particular thing. But icons can, in some cases, be multicultural, and this is certainly true of, say, for Catholicism, for example. Various icons in Catholicism, the Catholicism of seeing that particular icon in say Italy, could be radically different than what you'd find, say, in Ecuador or Peru, or Mexico or the United States, or say Hong Kong. But there would be some shared meanings, but there also might be very different shared meanings depending on the cultural context that the icon is placed within. So icons can be sort of a whole zoo, and there's whole books written on particular icons. But the key here is symbol. Symbol has been something that's been given meaning. Now, the trick to symbols, and this is where symbols are such an absolute furball to get involved in, it's basically in large part what we're looking at this semester, is the use of symbols. Is symbols do not have any relationship between the meaning and the object. So if you want to think of an example, there's the famous chairs from the 1950s, 60s, whose name is just escaping me right now. Very uncomfortable, very plastic 1950s, 1960s, sort of almost like a 1950s Art Deco look. Denise or Mies, I think is the name of it. At the time they originally were sold, you had them not because they were comfortable. If you've ever sat in some are so uncomfortable or painful, but they basically were making a statement that you didn't have large fluffy furniture. You were part of the modern contemporary world in the 1950s. You were you were part of the space age. They very quickly disappeared after that because, one, they were really uncomfortable, and two, they weren't particularly attractive. They were just really obviously glaringly plastic. In the last 10 years, they popped up again, and now the originals are actually worth a lot of money, and you actually find people selling them. You can buy them on Amazon, for example, and people are using them in interior design. Now, at some point, of course, on one hand, it's still an object, and it still has some of those meanings. But if you think about it, a chair that's a copy of an original that was the originals from 1960, the modern versions from 2022, the chair isn't really got the same meaning attached to it. It's now got another set of meanings, or like maybe replacement meanings. But if we suddenly segue 100 years into the future and no one's using chairs anymore, and someone comes back and looks at that, and it's in a museum, they're going to have a really hard time understanding if that context has been lost, because there's no relationship between why people had the object and what the function of the object was. In many cases, the object doesn't even have a function, or the function was almost irrelevant compared to what the meaning was. And this is why when you go to another culture, if you go to another place and you look at the world around you, you suddenly realize that you have very little idea of what's going on. And one of the major reasons for that is you do not understand the meaning attached to symbols. If you walk down a street in Hong Kong, or you walk down a street in Osaka in Japan, or if you walk down a street in Lyon in France, you're going to have a really hard time understanding what's going on, because those symbols are held within the context of the people who built them and used them. They're not part of your world. And because there's no necessary relationship between the functionality of the object or the graphic or whatever it is and what people's meaning is, you're not going to be able to maybe intuit, what it means to them, but just by virtue of seeing it. So symbols are a huge part of what I look at it. So it's basically my background is in the use of symbols. And it's a huge part of what makes up groups. And going back to the last presentation, this is a huge part of what makes up especially ethnicity is the use of symbols. And in many ways, then people get very protective about those symbols because those symbols to a certain extent give them identity and give them uniqueness and especially give them group identity. This is why all the noise about cultural appropriation, which is entirely legitimate, in terms of the people getting upset about it, in that groups that have power, have resources, can basically take symbols that belong to a group and modify them and use them in some other way that the original group feels is totally inappropriate and also takes ownership. It's like someone stole it from you. A perfect example back in, say, 40, 50 years ago would be the sudden popularity for a short period of time in tiki bars in the mainland United States. Using Polynesian, largely Marquesan, Tahitian images of ancestors, or maybe to a certain extent gods. But then they're putting them in a bar because they want to look exotic. So the entire original meaning of the object of the symbol has been lost or replaced by another set of symbols. This is still a huge part of tourism. You see a lot of this in places like Waikiki. If you look at a hotel lobby, the reuse, or in some cases actually abuse or misuse of symbols, is an enormous part of what groups talk about, especially in the tourism world that we live in the 21st century. Symbolic misrepresentation or symbolic appropriation, especially for the purposes of profit, is a huge part of what makes friction in terms of people's relationships. For those of you taking the interior design class, to a certain extent, you have to remember that everything you put in a house, well, the house itself, obviously, as we'll see in the first part, but later in the semester, every piece of furniture you put in a house is always symbolic. It might have a function, but in many cases, the symbolic aspect of that is much more important than the actual use of it. A good example in an American home would be dining tables. For most Americans in the 21st century, they very rarely use their dining table. Dining tables are almost more of an affectation of concepts of the family or group getting together, and talking and having a good time together around a shared meal at a shared table. If you think about the reality, even if they're at a dining table, everyone's probably on their iPhone 14 and they're all texting someone else. They're paying no attention to the person next to them. So the symbol, the idea that you have a dining table, a set of matched chairs in a room, might mean that that's a very non-functional, setting. The chairs are usable, the table is usable, but if you think of that use of space, it's wasted space. So symbols are something that are hugely important, but they're not, I'm not sure how to say this, you can't take the object and intuit the symbol. And you always have to remember this. It's really hard to remember within your own society, your own ethnic background, what symbols are, how they are intuited by members. It's much easier if you go to someplace else where all of a sudden none of that stuff makes any sense. This is why a foreign place seems so foreign, because you do not understand the symbolic context of the world around you. In geography, especially, anthropologists use this, but anthropologists are really sloppy about their use of place and space. The major term we use this semester, and used by folks like me, is the idea of the cultural landscape. Now, landscape is a term that geographers use probably way too much. It just means the world around us. But when you're talking about a cultural landscape, you're talking about the landscape that people have shaped. So it's not the landscape that was there prior to the human population, it's the landscape that people have. Now, this can get pretty tricky. You can have human landscapes that are shaped. A good example would be our campus. We'll see it later in the semester. That's a quintessentially human modified landscape. Now, it's modified twice. The Hawaiians modified the landscape in the 1600s for basically food production, but not very much. And then by the 1920s, 1930s, the Marinists came in and made it into a classic, Euro-American, temple of learning that's so typical of sort of the Dewey period of American education, which is what it is. And that whole campus is a beautiful example of a cultural landscape defined through a particularly very complex set of symbols that, again, if you're from outside the American educational system and sort of the Western, Euro-American experience, I'm not sure how you would see the Chaminade campus buildings. But I can guarantee you wouldn't understand a lot of it. Now, cultural landscapes also can, of course, be things that you save. So, for example, you could have, say, Yellowstone National Park. So you keep large parts of it natural, but it's sort of like a zoo because what you've done is you've modified everything around it and you've modified access and you've got trails and parking lots and places to view it. So it's still a human modified landscape, even though parts of it might not be human touched, but you've intentionally not touched it. So again, you've modified your view of that landscape in ways that were vastly different, say, when Native Americans were walking around there. And the last one, let's look at it this way. Switch here. Sorry, flopped over. Here's a good example since you just finished this holiday. Here's a conceptual landscape. Now we're going to see this early in the semester when we get, at least in the design class, when we get into the idea of virtual worlds. But here's a sort of what you might call static virtual world. This is a Christmas card. These are from, I think, 2 years ago. I don't remember. But if you look at them, these are the type of things that Americans send to other Americans to sort of remind them, or I'm not sure exactly what, of the idea of Christmas. They're based in a past that most Americans never had a part of, since Americans for the last 100 years have largely been urban. This is very much what I would call sort of a New England setting. If you actually look at this in detail, because again, the artist, if you're an artist and you make these things, you're painting them given a set of symbols that you have to include so that people will buy the card. Your purpose is to generate a piece of art that people will purchase. If no one buys it, then you're out of business. So these two particular cards are really fascinating because if you think of all the symbols they include that are supposed to sort of to Americans looking at this particular image, this is supposed to send a whole set of emotional, social, cognitive, stuff through you that reflects the idea of what Christmas should be, whether it be the deer here, I'm elk, I'm not sure what the hell they are. The idea you've got the old cars, back in the time when Americans really celebrated Christmas, the idea of the house, it's cold out and there's snow, or this one where you've actually got a sleigh. I can guarantee that 99.9% of Americans have never seen a sleigh. And I'd be hard put to find any place in the United States that would have this view of a house, a little tiny church over on the side and stuff like that. Even Williamsburg doesn't have that. So these places are very much artifacts of the imagination, but they only work because they work as a set of symbols. So if you can actually think of this from a digital standpoint, this is like a whole box of symbols that someone stuck together and made a card out of it. Again, a whole box of symbols, all which have meaning, all attached together to make this sort of sense of a particular point in time, a social engagement, etc. Christmas cards, in fact, various cards in general are a fascinating example of this in terms of the idea of the importance and power of symbols and also the cultural landscape, because these are both landscapes. They're not real landscapes. They're not a particular place in the world. They're both virtual in the sense that they're entirely within the imagination of the artist or whoever commissioned the painting. But nonetheless, they have power. But they are very culturally specific. I'm not sure how folks from Namibia would see these. Probably not much. They probably wouldn't understand most of it. It's entirely within an embedded context. I had to fish these out. Okay, here's an example of both cultural landscape and built environment. This is I don't know what you call it, I guess sort of an amusement park. This is a historical park in Xi'an in central China that was built about 10, 12 years ago now. So it's brand new, relatively speaking. All of this is fake. This is all concrete. It's all there was flat farmland. In fact, it was basically apartments, and a bunch of people got evicted. So all this has been built. It's a entirely fictional sort of fantasy Disney-like recreation of the period of around 700 AD called the Tang Dynasty in China, which many Chinese see as sort of like their cultural center. So in many ways, this is sort of the world that modern Chinese see made the world that they live in now. So what you see here is an entirely calculated move to use a huge number of symbols to basically bring that past to life. But you have to remember that it's not the past that actually was. I mean, I'm an archaeologist and I work with the Chinese archaeologists. Like, technically now I'm a Chinese archaeologist. So I know what this area used to look like, and it didn't look like this. But for modern Chinese, this is their view of their past. We'll get into this later when we look at places like Disneyland. So what you see here is you've got willow trees, which are hugely important in terms of Chinese symbolism. This particular type of bridge, which again is very, it's a recreation of a Tang Dynasty style bridge. Even the lamppost, the lady walking here in a Tang Dynasty outfit, they have a huge number of employees that just sort of walk around visually, I guess like the Disney folks, that walk around visually sort of recreating this. Of course, it's a little bit jarring because you got someone running around here in an electric cart. And of course, everyone there is in modern stuff. So this is a cultural landscape. It's a built environment. So it's a subset. Built environments are subset of cultural landscapes. It's a cultural landscape both in terms of what it is. It's also a landscape of the imagination, just like that Christmas card, in the sense that it's a bunch of symbols that have been placed and actually put in physical reality to refer to the modern view of the past, if you would, a fantasy past. And so in that regard, that's why built environments are always a subset of cultural landscapes. Built environments are fascinating because at some point they involve actual effort, cost, all sort of human labor, to basically shape the world in ways that you feel are necessary or should be. So, people were living in apartment buildings that were evicted. I think about 30,000 people were just evicted out of this part of Xi'an to build this amusement park. So one whole reality of life is gone. They're somewhere else. You've built this new thing for people to consume a fantasy version of their past. And this is important for them because it allows them to recreate the world that they feel was part of their past world so they can enjoy it in the present. Now, let me pause here for a second while I fish up the other picture. Okay, you might have noticed if you looked really carefully at the earlier picture, this was in the background. This is a classic example of how symbols are very, very culture specific. This is a Asian camel. I think they're called Bactrian or something like that. This one really likes to spit if you get too close to it. He's working up a good oogie right now. And this is you're supposed to either get drawn around by him, which he really I don't think he likes. Or even worse, you go and try to have a selfie done with it, at which point he usually does a hawk right up the back of your neck. I saw him do this to two girls. But he's dressed in an outfit that represents a very complex thing. We're just going to go into this little detail because it shows you how symbols are culture specific. Camels weren't used by the Chinese. Camels were used by Mongolians, Manchurians, Tibetans, other groups on the borders of China. So to Chinese seeing this isn't a Chinese thing. This is an exotic thing. This is part of the outliers of China that were brought into the Chinese Empire in the Tang Dynasty. And so at this point in time, China controlled almost all of East Asia. And that was one of the things that Chinese look to now when China controlled all these areas. And so all these things that were exotic were now basically owned or controlled by the Chinese. If you want to put it in the American context, think of people dressing up in Native American outfits. Or, for example, images of Native Americans on coinage or all sorts of stuff in the United States. Same thing here. This is a Mongolian outfit on this camel. This is Mongolian style embroidery. Mongolians love to put bows in the heads of these things, which is probably one reason he likes to spit at people. So this whole thing is very much a Chinese interpretation of a Mongolian cart that would have been seen in Tang Dynasty because in that period China controlled Mongolia. So for Chinese, like these girls walking by here, this is reflecting back in a period of time when China controlled all of East Asia. And so it could basically say, we want one of these carts. We want Mongolian guys to drive it because we're sophisticated, we're cosmopolitan, and we own this stuff. So this has a very complex set of messages that relate to the Chinese self-identity today and also their interpretation of their historic past. Now, notice you don't need a lot of accuracy. Obviously, this isn't, this is probably, I'm sure, machine made. This thing's got modern wheels on it. So there's a lot of this that has nothing to do with that past. And if you're going to be trying to be, quote, accurate about it. But in terms of cultural landscape, this is a cultural landscape. It's a cultural artifact that's placed here as part of a landscape. It's within a built environment of pavement and fake rocks and brought in plants to basically refer back to a fictitious point in time when China was the sort of overlord of basically everything east of Persia and now Iran, at the height of their power. And so for Chinese seeing this, it's a constant reminder that back in the day, we were something, and we were the something. And that's the power of symbols. Uh, and in this particular context, this is the power of cultural landscapes and the power of built environments. Now, from the standpoint of geographers and hardscape landscape specialists, it's absolutely fantastic because you have this thing fixed. People spent time and effort making it, and then you can actually both look at it. You can ask people what are the symbols. You can interpret it, and you can see the whole dynamic process of how place and space and people are all related. And most importantly, if you think about it, this is the first really good example of how perception drives reality. The perception of what this camel and what this place and all this stuff stands for drives the reality of it. People go to this part, and it gets a lot of people. It's very beautiful. It's very nicely done. And this camel's a riot to watch. But it's part of the reality of this place is based on the perception of the place.